Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham Yahweh Shai, Bahasham Rechak Kodesh. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Hosea, the 9th chapter. And as you can see in the subheading here, Ephraim punished. Okay, and as we go through this chapter, once again, right, continuing with the judgments being pronounced against Israel in here. So this is the book of Hosea, chapter 9, verse 1. Rejoice not, O Israel, for joy, as other people, for thou hast gone a whoring from thy God. Thou hast loved a reward upon every corn floor. And so here, right, what the message here is you know, you don't get to rejoice, right? You don't have a reason to be happy or joyous, okay, because the things you're doing are warranting some impending judgment, right? For going a whoring from your God, right? And once again, going a whoring, right? Playing the harlot, in this case, from the Lord would be likened onto worshiping different gods. Similar to how if a woman went whoring from her man, she would be engaging or dealing with other men. And that's here what Israel was doing. And it says here, thou hast loved a reward upon every corn floor. And the the corn floor, meaning like the threshing floor, the reward here is the hire of a prostitute. So there's the analogy being used there again, right? Which is to say, like you've hired, like you've whored yourself out, okay, pretty much on every threshing floor for a reward. Verse 2, the floor and the winepress shall not feed them. Now the floor being the threshing floor and the winepress being, you know, like it's like an area where they would put the grapes, step on them, right? And then they would get the blood of the grapes for wine. And so what the Lord is saying here is the floor, which represents the crops, right? Because when they would harvest, they would then thresh the crops, right, on the threshing floor and get the actual substance that they needed, the grain and so on. So by the Lord saying here, right, the floor and the winepress shall not feed them. That is to say, you're not gonna have enough, right? Your harvest is gonna be bad, and you're not gonna have enough to even thresh or to even put in the wine press or press to get that wine over there. And the new wine shall fail in her. See, once again. And so, you know, obviously there's many ways in which the Lord could do this, predominantly one being like famine, right? Droughts and so on that mess with the harvest cycle. Verse 3, they shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean things in Assyria. And in the context, right, in the time period of when Hosea was prophesying this against them, Egypt represented bondage, right? Because or hardships, because Israel or Ephraim or the northern kingdom, at no point in time was it recorded in history, whether in the scriptures or in extra biblical sources, that they were taken captive back to Egypt, right? That didn't happen. So when it says here that they shall return to Egypt at this time, right, what Hosea was saying to them, in other words, was that they were going to go back into that slavery or that bondage or that captivity, similar to how they were in Egypt, right? And they shall eat unclean things in Assyria, because they would be carried captive over there to Assyria. Now, of course, back then, this is pretty much what happened. Okay, but also this ended up on a prophetic, sense. This ended up happening here. All right, being that Egypt, right, is spiritually, or America is also spiritually known as Egypt and Assyria, right? When you read in the scriptures prophetically, this place is known as Egypt. 2nd Ezra 15, right, goes into that. 2nd Ezra 15 also goes into calling this place America or Babylon the Great, referring to it as Assyria. right? So prophetically, right, in the long term, this also ended up happening, um, in where Ephraim, or the northern kingdom, ended up coming here to America, right, as it says, Egypt, and eating unclean things in Assyria, right, which is both literal but also in the way that they would live. And that's what you see going on today. Okay, so there are some of the verses in here that, as Hosea prophesies these things, they do apply contextually to back then. Okay, but also there was that prophetic undertone of these things having a long-term, effect and manifesting also in this time. So in verse 4, it says here, they shall not offer wine or offer wine offerings to the Lord, neither shall they be pleasing unto him. Their sacrifices shall be unto them as the bread of mourners. All that eat it thereof shall be polluted. Right, and we know, um, with mourners, right. If we look this up in the NLT, right, it says here, they will be unclean like food touched by a person in mourning. And why is that? Because typically a person in mourning, they're usually mourning, like, for example, the loss of a loved one, right? And that involves, death, right? If you're at like a funeral or so on, or you touch a dead body, the scriptures talk about how it makes you unclean. Okay, so similar to how it says here, they will be unclean like food touched by a person in mourning. All who present such sacrifices will be defiled. So that's what the Lord is likening their offerings and sacrifices onto, as of that of a mourner's bread, that which, as it says, all that eat thereof shall be polluted. For their bread of their soul shall not come into the house of the Lord. So in other words, the Lord is not going to accept any of their offerings. He's going to look at it as a polluted thing. And when you look at it, if you go and serve and worship idols, and you make yourself unclean, and then you come to the house of the Lord trying to offer unto him, of course he's going to look at it as a polluted thing. And when we read in the book of Chronicles, I believe it was either during the time of King Hezekiah or King Josiah, where they sent a letter out, because at this point the northern kingdom, the bulk of them, had been taken captive to Assyria. However, there were still remnants of them dwelling in the land, right? I believe some in Manasseh, and so on. And so they sent letters among them concerning the Passover to say that, hey, come down to Jerusalem and let's all keep it together in returning back to the Lord, right? And then the scriptures say that some mocked, but some also came down, though they had to improvise for that Passover because majority of them were unclean. Okay. And why was that? Because they had been so long in the ways of idolatry, and in the ways of being misled and not serving the Lord, that a lot of them didn't even know how to properly prepare for the Passover. Verse 9, what will ye do in the solemn day, and in the day of the feast of the Lord Yahweh? So what are you going to do when these holy days come, right? And in the high holy days, the feast days, for lo, they are gone because of destruction, right? So the Lord, in other words, the Lord has taken that away due to the destruction that he brought. You can think of a case, like an example, during the time of Antiochus, right? How he took away the, basically due to his rule, we couldn't keep Sabbaths, right? We couldn't call ourselves Jews. We couldn't keep the holy days, right? By the destruction that he brought upon our people. So similarly, as it's saying here, what are you going to do when that time comes around? Because through the destruction that I'm going to bring upon you, I'm going to take all that away. Right? Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis shall bury them. The pleasant places for their silver, needles shall possess them. Thorns shall be in their tabernacles. Now, I also want to get this in NLT as well. As it says here, which in the NLT, they sort of interpret that first part about, lo, they are gone, as though as Israel escaping from Assyria. But when you read the verse above, right, it gives you the context as to what is gone here, right? Which is why that question is being asked. Well, what are you going to do in the holy days, right, in the solemn days and in the feast days, right, because those are going to be taken away through the destruction that I'm going to bring upon you. Anyway, the part I want to emphasize here is down here, right? As you can see, it says Egypt will conquer you and Memphis will bury you. Needles shall take over your treasures of silver, and thistles will invade your ruined homes. So, like I mentioned, there isn't really an account of Egypt coming and taking Israel captive here. Okay, but the back then during Hosea's time, this would represent Egypt here would represent the captivity that they would be going into. Okay, but also looking at it from the prophetic sense, Egypt being modern day America, when you go all the way into the future, right? If you follow the historical line of the Northern Kingdom here, what happened to them, right? They were sent captive to Assyria, right? They dwelt there for a period of time, and then they ended up leaving Assyria. It tells you that in Second Ezra, the 13th chapter, right? They left the east and came to the Americas, right? And they dwelt here for a time before, of course, Esau went back there to meet them again, right? As the conquistadors and the Spaniards and so on, right? What's this guy's name? Christopher Columbus and all of that. But after that period of time, you know, time moves forward a bit, and then you have that time period of slavery and so on. And really, when America was formed, right? If you go back during that early period when they started warring with the natives of this land and basically taking them over, pushing them onto reservations, building those railroads over their land, right? There's something known as the Trail of Tears, and I forget the what's his name? If I type it in here, something Anderson, Trail of Tears, Andrew Jackson. There you go, Andrew Jackson. But let me read it here. It says the Trail of Tears refers to the forced removal of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to Indian Territory. And then it goes on, so on and so forth. Now, keep in mind, the Northern Kingdom, right, also went into captivity and suffered hardships like the Southern Kingdom did. Okay, and the bulk of that happened here in the Americas, but it happened in this location at a specific time period, right? Because when the Northern Kingdom first came to America, it wasn't a place of captivity for them. Okay, it wasn't until Esau came here, planted his roots in here, that it then turned into a place of bondage and captivity for them. Okay, so in the prophetic sense, this Egypt here would be America, but at a time when it became the bondage or captivity of the Northern Kingdom here. Okay, so once again, back in context, right? This Egypt was representing the hardships or the slavery or the captivity that they were going, but at this time it would be under the Assyrians. Okay, though prophetically in the future, right, this would apply again, though Egypt will represent America at that time. And as we saw that happen, throughout history, right? If you go back and you look at around the time when Esau came here, you'll see examples of that. So as it says, Egypt shall gather them up. And as we read this in the NLT, right, as it's worded, Egypt will conquer you. Okay, and it mentions here Memphis, which is just a city in Egypt, but it's just reiterating the same point, right? As it says, Egypt shall gather them, Memphis shall bury them, i.e., this would be a burying place. And we see that happening, right, to a lot of Israelites. It says the pleasant places for their silver, needles shall possess them. So the places where you store up your treasures will be filled with needles, which when you look that up, right, it's just like thistles and let's see how they word it here. Right, thorns and useless plants and so on. Okay, which signifies basically destruction, right? So as one point you had, all this riches and, so on and so forth that you stored. Now it's just filled with like branches and plants and thorns. And as it says here, thorns shall be in their tabernacles, right? So the places where you used to dwell is going to be basically uninhabited anymore. Okay, and we see this sort of pattern throughout various other scriptures of, the writings of the prophets when they prophesied against Israel. Okay, and that's why, most of the breakdowns that we'll go through, or that we do go through and that we use today, it's important that we qualify them as well, right? Because most of the time we speak on the prophetic aspect of that, chapter or of that verse, but it's also important to know historically what was meant by that, right? Who was the prophet referring to at that time? How would that manifest at that time? But also understanding that there's a prophetic aspect to it, that would befall our people again in these times. Okay, so Hosea 9 and 6 being an example, right? And jumping into verse 7, it says, the days of visitation are come. The days of recompense are come. Israel shall know it. So now Hosea is telling them, look, for so long you've been going in the wrong way. We've been warning you and warning you and warning you, and you just are not taking heed. Well, now the Lord is about to visit you, right? He's about to recompense or pay you back for that trouble or that tribulation or that iniquity that you've been committing. And that's why it says Israel shall know it. There's going to be no doubt in anybody's mind what's going on. The prophet is a fool. The spiritual man is mad for the multitude of thine iniquity and the great hatred. So what that represents is the lack of guidance, right? And you know, let's just say lack of a better word here, information, right? Because typically the prophet, they would go to the prophet to consult about, things that they need to know, things concerning what the Lord has planned and so on. And the spiritual man likewise, right, for guidance and so on. So here by the Lord, well, by saying the prophet is a fool and the spiritual man is mad, that's to say you have no guidance, no information. All of that is now gone, taken away, right? The use of a prophet, the use of the spiritual man is gone now because of all your iniquity and your great hatred. And one other precept that comes to mind with this is I believe it's Ezekiel 7. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Ezekiel 7 and 26. Mischief shall come upon mischief, and rumor shall be upon rumor. Then shall they seek a vision of the prophet, but the law shall perish from the priest, and counsel from the ancients. See, so similarly, right, when you go to seek that information to have some stability, you're not gonna get it. So going back to Hosea chapter 9, verse 7, right? So basically, as he's saying here, when that destruction comes and that time of calamity comes, you're not going to have any answers. You're not going to have any solutions because you brought this upon yourself. Verse 8, the watchman of Ephraim was with my God, but the prophet is a snare and a fowler, the snare of a fowler in all his ways. So at one point, right, your watchmen, your prophets were, as it says, with my God, right? They were actually, prophets of the Lord. And this is excluding the righteous prophets like Hosea, and so on. Because keep in mind that at this time, not only did they have these false priests that they set up, right, base men, they also had those that they would go to as prophets of these other gods that they would go to for answers and for information and so on. So at one point, right, their watchmen followed what the Lord required, but now, as it says, their prophet is a snare of a fowler in all his ways, i.e. is a trap. So they'll prophesy one thing, which is deceits for their benefit. Okay, so they're not really prophesying onto you in the name of the Lord. It says, and hatred in the house of his God. So, and reading this, a couple of other translations, and you'll notice I often bring up these other translations because you can sort of see how they are worded, right? If you read the Old English and you're like, it's not too clear to me, look at a few other translations and see what is the common sense of what they're making of this verse, how are they wording it, and you'll start to get a better idea of what it's, what is the wording of the Old English trying to say. right? So, for example, in the NKJV, right, it says here, the watchman of Ephraim is with my God, but the prophet is a fowler's snare in all his ways, and enmity in the house of his God. NLT. Well, the NLT actually, for this verse, I don't quite think this part is quite accurate, because they interpret the prophet being a fowler's snare as traps are laid for the prophet wherever he goes, right? But as it's worded, the prophet is the snare in all his ways. So that would make more sense to be, by the words of that prophet deceiving the people. That is like the trap set by a fowler, right, to catch fowls. As it says, in hatred in the house of his God, because it wasn't going to end well for them in doing so. But all this is to highlight the corruption, right? All the corruption that was going on here in the land among the royalty, right? The kings, the princes, the priests, the common folk, the so-called prophets, all of them. Verse 9, they have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. Therefore, he will remember their iniquity. He will visit their sins. See? So that's why, as it continues in that verse, it emphasizes that they've corrupted themselves, right? They've completely deviated from the way, the righteous path the Lord set them on, in how to live and what to do and how to serve him. So as a result, the Lord is going to keep their iniquity in mind, and he's not going to overlook it. Verse 10, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first stripe, or the first stripe in the fig tree at her first time. So, in other words, the Lord is here recalling, right, when he got Israel, when he took Israel, made us his people, and so on. He's like, this is like finding grapes in the wilderness, which is a pleasant thing, right? Imagine you going through, a not so, rainforesty area and coming across, grapes. It's like a pleasant thing, right? And then the other example is like the first stripe of the fig tree, right, at her first time. So when you start to see that fig tree, start to first bring forth the fruit, that's a beautiful thing to see. And that's what the Lord is likening here Israel onto, going back to when he first delivered us from Egypt. That's why he mentions here your fathers. And he says here, but they went to Baal Peor. And, when you read the history, I believe it's in the book of Numbers, it goes into that, how even in the wilderness, you had Israelites that were defecting to other gods, Baal Peor being one of them. It says, and separated themselves onto that shame, right, which is that abomination of these idols. The Lord looks at that as a shameful thing. And their abominations were according as they loved. So they basically were led by their lusts, right, into these abominable things, such as worshiping these idols and so on and so forth. And those are the things that they set their heart upon. As for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away like a bird, from the birth and from the womb and from the conception. Now, what was the glory of Ephraim? Right? Though it's referring to the northern kingdom here, Ephraim is like the head. So that's why they're being referenced here so much. Similarly, when you read about judgments against the southern kingdom, you'll hear mention of Judah, 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 though that Judah consists of Benjamin and Levi as well. But here, dealing with Ephraim, the name Ephraim, right, in the Hebrew, Aparium, right, I believe it's fruitful, or he is fruitful. So that fruitfulness doesn't mean that they were going to be, apples were going to come out of their hands and stuff. But fruitfulness meaning, like, for example, their women were very fertile, right? So they will populate very quickly. They would have a lot of children. Like that was that thing. So if you're dealing with them Ephraimites, you better watch out. But anyway, so that was their glory. But the Lord is saying here, right, that glory is going to be taken away. It shall fly away like a bird. From the birth and from the womb and from the conception. So that's why it starts to mention this, like, children and bearing children, because that glory was their fruitfulness, and the Lord is going to take that away. So, for example, NKJV and NLT, right? As for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception, right? NLT, the glory of Israel will fly away like a bird, for your children will not be born or grow in the womb or even be conceived. Okay. Verse 12, though they bring up their children, yet will I bereave them. Okay. When you look into that word bereave, pretty much the Lord is going to take away their kids. Right? It says here to be deprived of a loved one through a profound absence, especially due to the loved one's death. And so, be it miscarriages, all sorts of complications, the Lord is going to, he was going to basically put that upon them. Right. And that would be a shame. That would be a recompense to say, like, yo, you at one point, you even, put your hand on her shoulder and she's already pregnant. And now, like, you look at your women today, or look at your women now, like having trouble with, having children and all these things. That was the judgment the Lord said he was going to bring. Right. So as it says here, I will bereave them. So their children are going to die, that there shall not be a man left. Yea, woe also to them when I depart from them. Okay. So the Lord is like, I'm going to bring this judgment upon you. I'm going to take away that glory that I gave you. And you're going to have a really hard time when I basically take away my protection and the benefits that I've been putting upon you. And I go to my own place and I leave you to fend for yourself. That's why he says, woe unto them when I depart from them. Now, in saying this, the Lord was going to apply this, mostly on a majority level, right? But not on 100% every single person, because if that was the case, then, Ephraimite women would be just infertile, right? And they would just, or even just the northern kingdom, they would just be infertile, right? They would be barren. And that wasn't the case. Okay. But they're not as fruitful as they once were. Verse 13, Ephraim, as I saw Tyrus, is planted in a pleasant place. So similar to Tyre, right? When you look at where they were located and how advantageous it was to them, they were, usually in a good position, right? Both financially, both in terms of geographical location by the body of water, they were doing good. So the Lord is here likening Ephraim onto that, saying, like, you were doing good, at one point. You were planted in a pleasant place by the water. You were not literally for Ephraim, but, you were in a good position. However, right, but Ephraim shall bring forth his children to the murderer, right? To say that you're going to bring forth your children, but they're going to be killed. They're not going to last long. Okay. And this murderer would be pretty much wherever their captivity would be. Okay. So back then it was Assyria, right? Historically. But for example, today, right, it's here in America. And who is the primary murderer here? Esau, Edom. So what is an example? How many times do you see? And most of the time they paint the picture as though this is usually just Southern Kingdom Israelites that are getting put to death, but Northern Kingdom Israelites get it just as much. Okay. And so you would have cases when people get shot, they get gunned down by the cops, they get, whatever the case is, that's whatever young man that is, young woman that is, that's the son or the daughter of somebody. Okay. And that's all, due to the judgment of the Lord upon Israel. So as it says in verse 14, give them, O Lord Yahweh, what wilt thou give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. Okay. And once again, like I said, this wasn't something the Lord did on 100% scale, right? This was just the majority. So though you may see, at least even from this point on, right? And this sort of carried out over time as well, right? So over time, the fruitfulness would decrease and decrease and decrease. So you may see, for example, today in today's time, you may see Israelites, yes, they're having kids and so on. But one, the quality, right, of them and their children are not how it used to be before, right? The fruitfulness is not how it used to be before. The death rates are much higher, whether it's during birth, whether it's after birth, meaning like you have children, but most of the time they don't really live to a full age because of the, whether they get thrown in jail, or they get murdered, or they get killed, or whatever the case is there. Okay. But with all this, which gets summed up as hardships, would come by um, the judgments of the Lord, or the curse of the Lord. Verse 15, all their wickedness is in Gilgal, for there I hated them, for the wickedness of their doing. I will drive them out of mine house. I will love them no more. All their princes are revolters, right? And so, obviously in the Lord saying he hated them, right? It's not in the sense that he hates Israel, but at that point he was very, angry, right? And felt, that level of indignation, all right, against them. Why? For their wicked doings. And as a result, he said, I would drive them out of mine house. So guess what? From that point on, when the Assyrians took them out of the land, they didn't go back there. The Lord did not allow them, the nation to be taken back there. As it says, I will love them no more. All their princes are revolters. So by the Lord saying that, meaning he would remove himself, he would, draw back his presence away from Israel, for that period of time. Though now in this time we have a way back to the Father, having been adopted back to the Father through Yahushua. And as it says, all the princes are revolters. So they've basically turned their backs on the Lord. Okay, doing whatever they want to do, executing judgments that satisfy their lust rather than following the righteous ways of the Lord and executing righteous judgment. And the princes are mentioned here because they are the ones, in positions of authority. So they should be the ones who are making the right decisions, right? Rather than influencing the people in the wrong way. Verse 16, Ephraim is smitten, their root is dried up. So now they're being likened onto like a tree. And when the roots of a tree are cooked, it's done. Okay. So as it says, their roots are dried up. They shall bear no fruit. Yea, though they bring forth, yet will I slay even the beloved fruit of their womb. Okay. So once again, there's that emphasis right there, the Lord bringing, and the judgments the Lord brought were, he still brought judgments in form of famine and so on and so forth, but this was more like a curse, that the Lord brought upon Israel, which is to reduce, your fruitfulness, okay, by many different ways. And some of those are even through, when the Lord says slay, some of those are through diseases. Okay, some of those are through like actual events that happen. You get shot, you get stabbed, whatever the case is. Okay, and some of them are through birth defects, and so on and so forth. So there's many ways to accomplish this that the Lord, has and did and is doing. As it says here, the beloved fruit of the womb, right? The fruit of your womb is your children. So that's why it says here, they shall bear no fruit. Yea, they shall bring forth, yet I will slay even the beloved fruit of their womb. My God shall cast them away, because they did not hearken unto him, and they shall be wanderers among the nations. And when you look into that word wanderers, in the interlinear, it says here nadad, all right, which is to flee, right? To retreat, to depart. So basically to be chased. And when you look at Israel or the diaspora, which in this case is applied to both the southern and the northern kingdom. Okay, but when you look at, because remember, Hosea says this at this time, but it's not like a instantly, right? This is something that, as it says here, they shall be wanderers among the nations. So because of your wickedness, this is what's going to happen to you. This is what's going to start happening to you. And so, yes, you had Israelites that migrated, but a majority of Israelites that are scattered, across the various parts of the world today are through means of fleeing, right, or being taken captive to a certain land, and so on and so forth, right, amongst these other nations. And when you go throughout the world into these other nations, yes, you have Israelites there that look physically like, the native inhabitants of that nation, but you can always tell by what community or what section that they're in that these are Israelites based on how they're treated, and or how they live. Okay, it's not that of, that royal state that the Lord created us to be in. Okay, so that's why they're likened onto being wanderers among the nations, which was a part of the curse or the judgment that the Lord brought upon us because of this iniquity and this hard-headedness. So anyway, that brings us to the end of the book of Hosea, the 9th chapter. Lord willing, that was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Recha Kudash. And until next time, Shalom.